Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. So happy to have you all here. My name is Sarah Stefanich, and I am the Professional Development Coordinator with Clout World Languages. So I'm very excited to welcome you all to our first webinar of our new school year, a new academic year. So thank you so much for being with us. We know the back to school season is very busy, and we appreciate your time and your attendance. And I'm very excited for our first speaker here, and I think we're in for a real treat. So it is my honor to present to everyone Dr. Florencia Henshaw. And Florencia has a PhD in second language acquisition and teacher education from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she is now also the Director of Advanced Spanish. She is an award-winning educator and author who has published and presented nationally and internationally on technology integration and proficiency-based instruction. Her new co-authored book, Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Theory Goes to the Classroom, also helps to aim educators visualize how to put principles into action. It's a great book. I have a copy and I'm working my way through it. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Florencia Henshaw for our session today.
All right. Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm looking at the number of participants, and I am truly, truly flattered. We all know how busy and draining the first few weeks are. So I am incredibly honored that you're joining us today. Also, as you can see, I look much better black and white than in real life. But that picture actually comes from another recent book, more recent than Common Ground, which Sarah didn't mention, but I'm going to add the shameless pitch right here, Honing Our Craft, World Language Teaching Today. And that is an co-edited volume with Kim Potowski, and we have chapters on a variety of topics. So check it out. If either Sarah or Sabrina can add the list, thank you so much. And you can check it out. In what I like is the diversity of viewpoints, the diversity of topics, which I think reflects. Oh my goodness, I know so many people in the chat. That is awesome. Hi Mirna, hi Jason. Oh my goodness. It reflects the many challenges that we have as language educators of all of the things to consider. And what I'm going to be talking about today is just a fraction of the many things that we need to consider as language educators, and that is language development. In one way that we definitely think about the language development, or what drives language development, is interpretive communication, is comprehension, right? We all know, we probably heard, and we all agree with the fact that input is absolutely necessary. And by input, we mean understanding language, understanding messages. And so I think that pausing to talk about interpretive communication and how to make the most of it is very, very important. Before I begin, I'll tell you some, oh, Heidi's here too. Oh my goodness, I know so many people. Before I begin, I just want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation, if I'm the only one, I'm the only one, and I'm okay with that, but have you ever been in a situation where you spent a good amount of time, let's say hours, but a good amount of time searching for a resource, and then you found it, and then you spent another good amount of time trying to figure out what to do with the resource, and then you finally use it in class, and you realize you spent more time searching for it and figuring out what to do with it than the actual time you spent doing things with it. Have you ever been in a situation like that? And you can type in the chat. Too often, victim. All right. So it's not just me. It's not just me. Okay, good. And what I notice also is in textbooks. Thank you, Claude, but I'm sorry. I got to say something about textbooks. In a lot of textbooks, which maybe could be, a little bit of space, right? The space on the page is very important, but interpretive communication is important. What I noticed is that they found a beautiful resource, but then all they give us is like 2 questions before reading, 2 questions after reading, and then we move on. And you're like, oh, like I need to get, more out of this resource. Hay que sacarle el jugo. Like you want to squeeze it to the last drop, right? And so that was the impetus behind this session, right? What else can we do or should we be doing beyond the 1 or 2 questions to, start thinking of the topic and then true, false, and then you're like, I don't know what else to do, so let's just move on. Oh, but you spend so much time, finding this. Let's see if we can find other ways of doing more with our resources. Can you not see me? I don't know what's going on in the chat. Can everybody see me and see the slides? We're good? Oh, you cannot. Oh. Uh-oh. All right. It's just the slides. I don't know what's happening, Sarah, why they, okay. Oh, some people are in full screen. Okay.
Okay.
All right. There's a lot going on. Okay. We'll go now? We'll go now.
Okay. Looks like, yeah, maybe you have to be able to exit full screen to see Florencia in her side, but some people can still see you, so.
You're not missing much. You're not missing much. You're good. If you can see my slides, that's all that matters. All right. Okay. So let's start by defining or at least discussing interpretive communication. And you'll see that in this title, I have interpretive communication / comprehension. And if you are an ACTFL person and you follow everything ACTFL says, you'll probably know that ACTFL is famous for saying that interpretive communication is not comprehension, or that interpretive communication is different from comprehension. Okay, so they had really good intentions, and that is to say that, yes, it's true that when we engage with a text, any kind of text, we do more than simply and literally understand the words in it. But if we go by what the literature in first language reading, second language reading has always followed, the definition of comprehension is always much more than literal understanding or retrieving specific information. That comprehension necessarily involves interpretation of language and in its particular context. So you will see that a lot of, the title slide for this webinar was interpretive communication. I followed sort of the lingo that ACTFL uses, but you'll see that in a lot of my presentation, I say comprehension. And I just want to clarify that I don't mean literally just understanding words, but you'll see how they can demonstrate comprehension beyond just understanding words. I also want to clarify the use of the word text. If you are familiar with multiliteracies, we have a chapter about that in Honing Our Craft. But if you're familiar with multiliteracies, you're not surprised by this bullet point that text can be written, oral, or visual, right? So that the word text is going to come up. Think of any kind of resource, if you will. Now, interpretive communication does need to involve language. And the reason why I clarify that is because sometimes I get questions about interpretive communication using a painting, for example. Well, it's true that you are interpreting what you see, but for the purposes of interpretive communication, of what you're doing with the language itself, is about understanding language, has to involve language within the text. And then of course, the main point that is going to come up, and the reason why we're having this webinar, and I think the reason why you're attending this webinar or watching the recording, is that comprehension is absolutely essential to language development. It is not just a corollary to vocab and grammar. So it's not about doing, here's some vocab, here's some grammar, practice, and here comes the section on read this, now watch this video, and we move on, which is usually how textbooks are designed, right? But rather, interpretive communication, the comprehension part, should be what is driving everything. And I also want to keep emphasizing the essential part of language development, because if you follow ACTFL in the 3 modes, you essentially end up favoring output, right? You end up favoring presentational and interpersonal, the other 2 modes, and poor comprehension is only 1 mode. So let's make sure that, yes, I understand you want to hit the other modes too, but let's not forget about comprehension and interpretive communication at all levels, not just at the beginning, but at all levels. Let's talk before we get into text and the activities, the fun part of why you're here. Comprehension is everything, absolutely. Let's get, and comprehension is also communication, by the way. You know, a lot of people think communication is just the other part, but comprehension is also communication. So what contributes to comprehension? And these are the things that many times we consciously or subconsciously keep in mind when we are selecting the resource or selecting the text or creating the text or resource. So the first one, and this is the one that research has shown, probably not surprisingly, that correlates the most or the best with comprehension, and that is linguistic knowledge. If we don't understand the language, doesn't matter how much background knowledge you have, you don't know what you're reading, right? So of course, linguistic knowledge always correlates to comprehension. So to what extent are the learners able to understand the language of the text? And when we are selecting a text or creating the text, in general, the rule of thumb is to aim for growth, but without too many growing pains. So you don't want to push them so far that they are stretching their language skills to the point of frustration, because then it no longer becomes an enjoyable challenge, right? So as much as possible, let's keep them in that comfort zone of understanding most of it. Background knowledge is undeniable, right? So for example, if you are attending this webinar, which is in itself a type of text, let's say you're watching the recording, that is a video, is a text, and you are understanding what I'm saying. If you, let's say, come here with a lot of knowledge about second language acquisition, and you already read Common Ground, and you, I don't know, read some of the work on second language reading, you're watching this with a lot of background knowledge, and you're like, yeah, I understand, right? It goes kind of more smoothly, right? Because your brain is already anticipating things and is already easily understanding what I'm talking about. But if you maybe have no idea about any of second language acquisition, about no idea what Common Ground even is, I don't know, have never taught, I don't know. You're watching this, you go, oh my goodness, this is a lot of new information that this person is throwing at me, right? And so it's going to be a little bit more difficult for your brain to stay focused and to keep understanding what I'm talking about, right? So definitely background knowledge is definitely important. The more we know, the more we anticipate and do. So even if you skip a little bit, you're still, keeping up with the presentation. Whereas if you really have no background knowledge, it's going to become really, really difficult for you to keep up with it. And then text features are also important for comprehension. Things like sections, images, numbers, graphics. If we're talking about audiovisual things like gestures also help comprehension. Speech rate can definitely affect comprehension. So there's many other features of the text itself that can affect comprehension, of course. So when selecting the text, and again, reminder, text can be written or visual, right? So it could be a video, it could be a song, it could be an article, right? Anything. I'm curious, what are your top 2 factors out of these 5 that you see on this particular slide? And we're not judging, but just tell me what your top 2 factors are. Okay, I see Heidi. Okay. Okay. I see a lot of A's. That's the pattern that I'm noticing. I've seen some D's also. I'm seeing a lot of D's. Some E's, okay. B, interesting. We're going to unpack that in a minute. Okay. That's awesome. Okay, I'm noticing a very, very clear pattern of A. Some of you did not choose A, and that is okay. And you may have specific reasons not to, right? Because sometimes perhaps it depends. For example, if you are teaching heritage speakers that are already very advanced, maybe that's not one of the things that you, I'm going to get to authenticity in a minute, I promise. Maybe that's not one of the top factors right now that you consider, right? But if you're teaching probably the second language learners in lower levels, comprehensibility tends to be one of the top factors that it depends on what you're working in class too, of course. And yes, D, relevance and appropriateness, right? We want it to be relevant to our students, and then of course we want it to be appropriate for our students. So definitely something we need to keep in mind. I'm not saying the other ones are not important, okay? Let's just be clear here. For example, teaching heritage speakers, representation matters so much, that you want as many groups as possible represented, and for their students to see themselves and see others in the resources. So then I would say probably representation more than A for my heritage speakers, por ejemplo, just for instance, right? But again, we're not ranking the factors as in, you chose the right answer and the wrong answer. So I completely understand your choices depend on your students and your context. In general, right? In general, if we are in proficiency-based instruction, E tends to not be the most, the top of the top, simply because we see the language just as a tool for communication. So the message itself and how comprehensible it is matters more than exactly how or which structures were used, right? So we give priority to the message over the how. But I understand in different programs you may have different goals, and so that might be something that you keep in mind as well. Let's see. Hang on, we have some questions already. So I assume some of the others. In a way, yes, Simon. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name correctly. Yes, some of these have overlapped, right? So for example, authenticity and representation, sometimes there's some overlap, that you're choosing authentic resources because you want representation from different groups, and that's the only way that you can get it, for example. Okay, so in those cases, yes, I can see that there could be some overlap there. Now, let's talk a little bit about text, and especially this question of authenticity, right, and different types of text. So on the one extreme of the spectrum, we have simplified text. Simplified texts are potentially unnatural. They tend to be very manipulated, heavily manipulated, as in usually they involve the forced use of structures that tend to be repetitive on purpose. And they are pragmatically questionable, as in who talks like that? These are like maybe the kinds of things that we think about from like older textbooks, where they had those dialogues where they included every form of a particular verb, and it felt very, very forced, right? Those tend to be the simplified ones. On the other side of the spectrum, the other extreme, if you will, is what some people call authentic texts. And these, the best definition that I could give you is that they were not made for language learning, and they're found in unmodified, right? So they're the extreme of it. In the middle, there's an important category that I think we need to keep in mind and not ditch it with a simplified text. And that is modified. So modified are texts that have been adjusted while respecting both the language and the level of the audience. And when you think about it, a lot of what you do in class, maybe sometimes borders on simplified, right? Maybe sometimes I do it too, right? You oversimplify, I get it. But a lot of what you're doing in class is you're modifying how you talk to be comprehensible to your audience, right? And when you think about it, this is what we do in many authentic contexts, right? Depending on who you're talking to, the way you explain something or the way you communicate is going to vary, and you're going to modify what you do. You're going to be clarifying things because you anticipate that the person may not know what you're talking about. So we modify how we communicate in any context, right? Even when you think about children's books, they are modified, right? They don't look like, a biography, right? They're going to look different, right? That maybe the sentences are shorter, maybe the language is a little bit simpler, a little bit more repetitive sometimes, right? So some of those things are already happening in authentic context. So to me, there's absolutely nothing wrong with modified text. I would even say that sometimes some simplified texts can work too, right? It just depends on how unnatural they are. That's where I draw the line. If it's like, okay, this, like, who would actually say this? Now it becomes input that is not actually respecting the language, then okay, we need to have that conversation. But as long as we are respecting how the language is used, and we are respecting what the students can do, the level of our audience, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with modifying text. Of course, if you like authentic resources, you have lots of them and they're working great for you, we are not anti-authentic either, right? My take on authentic resources is that there are some problematic definitions and implications of authentic resources. I absolutely do not like any kind of association between authenticity and native speakers, because then that implies that our students, or even some of us, are forever and ever inauthentic. I'm not a native English speaker, and here I am talking to you in English. So are you feeling that this is not authentic? I still feel authentic myself. And so, some of the definitions of authentic resources can be problematic. Also, sometimes the word authentic is very emotionally charged, right? Authentic is good, right? Is what we're aiming for. Everything else is like subpar. There's no reason to think that way. As I said before, we modify our language all the time, even in authentic situations. There's other issues with authentic resources, association with foreign, right, with resources that are not found in the US. In the case of Spanish, I find that in many other languages, I find that very problematic, right? Like we need to be reflecting US Spanish also authentic. But I have a whole video on unpacking the definition of authentic resources. To me, the bottom line is the authenticity of the resource itself should not be more important than its pedagogical value. So if you have a resource, or you create a resource for your students, that has a lot of pedagogical value, right? That you have, a language that they can understand and enjoy. Let's not forget enjoyment, that they can understand and enjoy, that they're learning something really valuable. Great, that's a lot of pedagogical value. Cares if you created it instead of found it and not modified it? Is still very, very valuable. So let's not put the authenticity over the pedagogical value. And I think that all resources have their own purposes, their own value, and it depends on your purposes and your goals with your students. So I know that there's a lot of talk. I understand anytime you start talking about authentic resources, everybody wants to chime in. So keep going in the chat, please, if you want to keep discussing authentic resources. I'll give you a couple of examples of not authentic resources. This one here is a text that I created. This is what I call a video reading. And this is essentially me writing a text based on information that I am summarizing from online. And it's information that I cannot find it as an unmodified resource. This is information about the refugee center here in town, and we are a pretty small town. So I don't have it beautifully laid out for my students in Spanish to understand. And also, I need to respect the language and the level of the students that may not have the level. This is 4th semester. A lot of students are still intermediate low. Most of them are intermediate low. And so I'm going to have to simplify a lot, use a lot of cognates. And so I want them to feel good about understanding the information and feeling accomplished that they were able to understand so much. And for that, I need to modify the resource. I need to modify the information. And then on top of that, this was bimodal input, which means that they hear me read it out loud and they see the text on the slide. And so on top of it being something that they can understand more easily and then feel accomplished that they understood so much, is pedagogically beneficial simply because they can listen to it and read and see it written at the same time. Another example, this comes from Aula Internacional. This is an example of a resource that was clearly just created for this textbook. But I think that it's respecting the language and it's respecting what the learners can do. Yes, you might see profiles of people in language exchange sites, but you're going to spend a lot of time if you go to those sites and then you have to filter what's appropriate, what the levels are going to understand, and then what it's just going to take way too much time for what you can get out of it when you can modify it, right? Just simplify the parts, maybe make the sentences a little bit shorter. Maybe, okay, they're not going to know what this is. Just change it with something they do know, because you do want them, yes, you want them to expand, but you want them to be able to understand in a way that is not frustrating, right? And also not overwhelming. And so this is another example of a resource that was created for learners, but it's still respecting what it could look like out there, and also respecting the level of the students, right? Okay, so the other thing that I want to say about authentic text before we move on is that an authentic text doesn't always have to be an input source. There's a lot of authentic resources that can help you maintain that authenticity part of it, but then you provide the language side of it or the input side of it. And so sometimes you can use artwork, and that is definitely authentic, but then the description of it, for example, is something that you create, modified, so that the students are understanding the language side of it. Weather maps, I know that, of course, it would be great to go to any weather place and right away you have it all perfectly laid out for your students to understand. But I don't know if you've ever seen, I don't know in English, but at least in Spanish, it feels like we have 20 different ways of expressing the same kind of weather. And so I would find it extremely overwhelming, right? If I was just starting out with Spanish. So, okay, maybe, yeah, I don't know what's going on, but seriously, every country has their own little tweak to how they express the weather. And so, okay, let's use the weather map, which is a resource. It's authentic, and then it's easy to understand. Obviously, there's no language, but then you provide the language side of it, right? Or even sometimes short films that you find online. There's one in particular, it's called Rutina, and it is made by a Spanish filmmaker, but it is completely without words. Right. And so you see this young man going about his day, but there's absolutely no words at all. And so it is an authentic text because it was authentically created by a Spanish filmmaker. And you see him going about his day very authentically in Spain, but there's no language. So maybe you can provide the language side of it if you want to use it for interpretive communication. Also, let's not forget about a lot of resources that could serve as partial input sources. Things like a schedule, for example, could be a partial input source. So yes, maybe the schedule itself, you use that? Okay, wonderful. Maybe the schedule itself, it's not giving you a lot, right? A lot of contextualized language, I guess, but then you could add it. Or maybe you find a blog post that sounds good, looks good, but the post itself is too dense. It's going to be too difficult for the students to to understand. And so maybe you only do the screenshot of the heading of the blog, the picture, and just the small blurb with maybe some help, but then the rest you modify it so that the students are understanding the rest of it. And so maybe you have a partially authentic, if you will, input part of it. Okay, so now let's talk about the meat of it, right? The working with text themselves. they just simplify it, right? We usually want them to do something before engaging with the text. I tend to like them doing something active while engaging with the text. And then, of course, we want to make sure that they understood and they can do much more with it after reading or listening. And I say reading, listening, of course, viewing in the case of ASL, we would also include that as well, of course. Okay, so let's talk about some of the pre-reading, pre-listening activities. And this is probably my biggest pet peeve, and my method students hate me because I always insist on this a lot. And textbooks always let me down. No offense to Claire, but textbooks always let me down when it comes to the pre-activities. And that is that the pre-activities should not be a one and done. The pre-activities is where we really need to be working with them a lot. So there should be several pre-reading, pre-listening activities. And those should be specific to the text, not just the topic. When you look at a lot of the resources out there, a lot of textbooks, you'll see that almost inevitably all of the pre-reading or pre-listening is about the topic, but not necessarily about the text itself. So that's one area for reflection. If you want to take a look at your own activities and see how often are you asking them to do pre-activities that involves the text itself and not just the topic. And I'll clarify what I mean with some examples in just a minute. The goal of the pre-activities is to activate both prior knowledge and preview the language they will encounter in the text. Many times we stick with topic, we stick with background knowledge, and we jump to the text. It's very uncommon to see a lot of the pre-reading or pre-listening to be engaging actively with the language of the text itself. And so that's one thing to consider adding if you're not doing that yet. This is an example from a textbook. No voy a decir cuál. I'm not going to say which textbook, because this is not about criticizing anyone in particular. This is one example of many. Grab any textbook, go to the reading or the viewing section, and you're going to see exactly the same thing. And that is, they're going to be watching this short film. And as you can see, I know that if you don't speak Spanish, you can at least tell the pre-reading, antes de pre-viewing, antes de mirar, before watching, it's just 3 questions, essentially. And then the next thing I see is the true false, right? So all they were asked were things like, do you believe in destiny, or do you think things happen by chance? Do you believe in love at first sight? Have you ever had something happen that you couldn't explain? So if the student just says, yeah, I believe in destiny. No, I don't believe in love at first sight. No, has never happened. And then what do? We just stare at the wall and we're like, okay, let's watch this film. It's just, it doesn't prepare them enough. I think it's okay to maybe start there, but then we need to be anticipating the kinds of answers that they can give us, and then how closely connected are their answers to the actual text. Because sometimes we may have good intentions, but the knowledge they're activating is something unrelated to what is happening in this film, for example. Or sometimes the types of answers they're going to be given have nothing to do with the language they're going to be encountering. And so are we adequately preparing them to encounter that particular text and to facilitate comprehension of that particular text? As you can see here, obviously I had to crop it, but you'll see that even there's useful vocabulary, right? So we already know that they're probably going to need some help with vocab. Why is it that we're not engaging with that before reading? We see that there's a beautiful screenshot of the, or a thumbnail, I guess, sorry, of the short film. There are no questions about it. What is happening in it? Who is who, right? Can we start anticipating? There's nothing, right? So instead of only focusing on broad topic, right, or message of the movie, and maybe a little bit of just personal connection, That is one place to start, no problem there. But then we gotta do a lot more before we get to the text if our goal is to facilitate comprehension. So what do I mean by actively previewing the language? It has to be selected, targeted, intentional, specific to the text. I tell my method students, no, don't just give me any word related to this topic. Go look at the text and start underlining, start taking words straight from this text. If it's a movie, then you got to watch it and take notes of the language that they're using and do specific to the text. Why do we want to do that? Because yes, it's true that we learn some words, not a lot, some words from reading and from viewing, yes, but we want to increase the odds of that happening. And so what we want for vocabulary retention is multiple encounters, right? So if they have seen it in preview and they see it during the movie and they see it again in post, at least we see that word 3 times, right? Anticipation, if you're doing things that are specific to the language of the text, they're already anticipating a lot. That reduces the cognitive resources that are going on while they're watching the movie or while they're reading the story, for example. Also, for vocabulary acquisition, we want active engagement with the vocab, not just glosses. If the student is just reading, they see the translation, they keep going, it's less likely that they're going to retain it than if they had to do something active with that particular word. And then, of course, we want them to start putting some strategies in action if possible. And I'll show you some examples of questions that target that in particular. Things that we can do with previewing the language are many of the things that we probably do with vocabulary. Things like matching, odd one out, true, false, mind maps, word association, word families, etc. So doing a lot of the active side of it with the language of the text. This is an example from a short story that is called Cajas de Cartón. If you teach heritage speakers, you probably have read Cajas de Cartón. And so in this particular question, yes, Alma, okay. In this particular question, it says, I'll translate, it says, in the story, there are 2 symbolic elements. So I'm already helping the students anticipate a little bit of what we're going to be talking about later on, right? So the car and the pot, sorry, the Spanish got activated, but the English, no, the pot, right? Okay. Indicate which of these words or expressions are related with the car or with the pot. And then if you think that some could be both, mark both. And so in here, what I did was I compiled actually all of the words that appeared somewhere in the story, right? And what I wanted to do was for the students to look at it and go, capota. What is that? Hang on, we got to look it up. So they're already doing something active with it instead of just me translating for them, just to get them to start searching for words. It's one of the things that facilitates retention of vocabulary, right? So some of them, maybe their partner already knew what it was and can help them out. No problem there. But if they need that help searching for it, I make them work for it. They need to search it. Some of them, of course, motor is a cognate. So that one they kind of knew. And so at least we are already anticipating some of the vocabulary that is coming up. We're anticipating the symbolic elements, right? So we're getting them to start thinking about the language that is going to appear and the elements that are going to appear. I'm seeing a lot of questions about the link to the recording, and yes, I believe that there will be a link to the recording. Okay. Other examples of questions, and this is where I wanted the students to start thinking actively of the strategies, reading strategies that we don't force them, but we could put into use. So for example, deducing the meaning of a word based on its composition, right? So in Spanish, we have this adjective cabizbajos, like head low, right? And so understanding that is, made up of these 2 words, what do you think it means, right? And so they had options to get them going, but we could also discuss it in class. In the story, you see this particular verb. Think of other, verbs, like trying to get them to notice word families and the composition of different words. What do you think it means, right? Another one that has to do with to distance yourself or to go far away, right? It comes from the adverb far. And so anyway, these are just examples of ways that you can, looking at the text, I would find these words and be like, okay, I can ask them this one, they can deduce. And so before they read, we had questions like this to discuss. Of course, pre-reading, previewing classic is brainstorming, right? So I don't have to explain to you how brainstorming works or mind maps, great. A twist on it, if you want to try something different, would be collaborative brainstorming. I did this in my methods class and it worked really well, but I can see it working also really well with language students. And essentially what it is you write the center node. In this case, the center node was feedback, and it was a relay mind map. So one student at a time went to the board and added a node. So they could add a node to the center one, the topic of feedback, or they could add to something that a classmate wrote. And so they kept going one at a time and kept paying attention to what people were adding so that they could go in and add another one. I mean, if you want to turn it into a game, you can. If you want to just make it as a collaborative activity, of course, doesn't have to be always a game. Something else that you can do as pre-reading or listening to be anticipating perhaps some of the things that are going to appear in that text would be for students to be indicating agreement with specific opinions that are given in that video or in that article, right? And so what I did here, the 4 items that you have here are some of the words are taken from the text because I want them to start anticipating, but then obviously they're all made into opinions, right? So that they could indicate agreement. And you can indicate agreement in many different ways. The classic with the 1 through 5, with your hand, students can easily indicate agreement that way. Another way, if you're doing something maybe more technological, if you're one-on-one and want the students to do something like that, could be something like a Jamboard type thing where they indicate, drawing the line, right, from completely agree to completely disagree. Or you can even do it with clapping, right? And so the extremes are standing ovation is fully agree, and then arms crossed is fully disagree. But then they can clap softly if they partially agree. And the same items, I'm going to be using them again. We're going to revisit them again after they have read the article, and that way they can revisit the statements and see if that is true, if the author agreed with these statements or not. Another example. Las malas palabras. Oh, that... Lizzie, no, that's the topic of the part of the topic of the reading that they had. So it wasn't. I just put the example. You don't have to use those statements. It wasn't for you to agree or disagree. That's just one particular example from the topic that they read a text. They read a text on malas palabras, which in different cultures, right, are perceived differently. So the students are fascinated by that. Yeah. But anyway. Las me parece muy bien, Lizzie. Yo también. Me too. All right. So another example of an activity, of a structure, if you will, that I love to use is this idea of the pre connecting to the post. So in the one that I showed you here was the statements were the student's opinion, but the post was almost like does the author agree with you or not? So another way that you can do that, where the pre then connects later on to the post, is something, for example, involving dictation. I know dictation has this bad rap of something being old-fashioned, right, and all that, but actually dictation has a lot of pedagogical value. And so the pre-watching part, you you do the dictation of a summary of the content or the plot with some inaccurate details. The students are just listening to you and writing. You do the, display, make sure you correct it, todo bien, right? Does everything match? But the good thing about it is that you're not just dictating random sentences. This is the summary of what they're going to be doing. So you're anticipating content and language with this little paragraph. Plus, it's multiple modalities, which is good for language learning. And then they watch or read whatever the text was. And then that little summary, you use it for them to be correcting the inaccurate part. So the students need to be paying attention to the meaning of this little paragraph that you just told them, right? So I'm just curious if we pause here just for a couple minutes, if you want to share of the pre-reading or listening ideas so far. Does anybody want to share the answer to one of these questions? You don't have to say all three, but maybe something that you already do and like, something that you would be interested in trying, or maybe that you're not sure about. Chelsea says all of them. Thank you, Chelsea. Relay mind map. Okay. Yes. Try it, Andrea. Muy bien. Yes. It's fun. My students, it was not a game and they all got into it. They wanted to keep adding. So that was good. Okay. Relay mind map. Okay. Beautiful. Dictation idea. Yes. And again, I know I keep bringing up heritage speakers, but it's great for that. Yes. Students need to look at from the text. Yes, absolutely. Agreement or not with statements that then you can use later. Beautiful. Okay. Partial impostor says yes. Okay, wonderful. Okay, yes, try the dictation pre and post. Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Okay, so let's get to the post part, or the during and post part. So to demonstrate comprehension, the way that I explain it is, a lot of the times we stay with the lines, right? Did you understand the language? Right? We stay with the lines itself, if you will, the main ideas, right? Maybe some of the details, and then we tend to move on, or maybe sometimes we incorporate some between the lines, maybe the inferences, right? But I think the beauty of it for me is going from understanding the lines to understanding between the lines, and then creating beyond the lines. So using that information to then connect to comparisons, apply it, right? So go beyond simply this text, you got it, and then we move on. And so I'm going to give you some ideas for that. Once again, I'm going to keep insisting on this. You should see my students. They're like tired of this. They need to be text dependent, right? It has to be, just like I said, the pre has to be connected to the text itself. Same goes for during and post activities. Could the students answer without having understood? If the answer to that is yes, then I need to tweak something to make sure that the students are answering based on the information they understood from the text. I want to keep it varied, so not just one thing, not just hear the questions, you answer correctly, we move on. Nothing wrong with it, true, false. Hey, I do it all the time. I do questions too. Can we do something else with it so that it's not just comprehension questions and we move on? And then, of course, I want them to have, if possible, not always possible, if possible, active engagement while reading or listening, which is another way of demonstrating comprehension, so that you may not need to be doing the traditional comprehension questions, as long as it's not too distracting, right? Because we want them to have enough resources to be understanding the text, but there might be ways that they can be actively engaged with it. And I'll show you one example. The question I get a lot is, when you do the post activities, in what language should you use it, right? So should it be the target language? Should we share the shared language if you have a shared language? My question back is, why singular? Why not mix languages? Why not use more than one language, depending on the question that you're asking, right? I think it's going to depend on your students a lot as well, of course, because if the shared language is not a dominant language for everybody, then it's not fair, right? It's also going to depend on the pedagogical purpose and the activity itself. Some activities work a lot better if you do it in the target language. Some activities work a lot better in terms of comprehension if you do them in the shared language. Also, the target language questions sometimes are there not just to assess comprehension, but also to engage in continued development of the language skills. So it could be that you wanted to do it in the target language, so that we could be discussing the text in the target language so that they could continue developing their skills. So it's going to depend a lot on your purpose. It is absolutely true that if your purpose is 100% assessing comprehension of the text, then yes, using the shared language or a language that the student feels most comfortable with, that tends to work better, yes. And then, so just to give you a few ideas and why sometimes it's hard to choose in what language you would do it. So for example, if the students read a short story, they read the summary with inaccurate details and they need to correct the parts that are not right. Even that is hard to say. Would you do the summary in the target language or would you do the summary in English or the shared language? Many times we might choose English or the shared language simply because we don't want the students to just be doing text matching, right? But what if your learners are more advanced and you can do a summary using synonyms? Nothing wrong there, right? So it's going to depend a lot on the context and your purpose, right? If the students need to put the events of a news story in chronological order based on an article that they read, probably I would be inclined to do that in a shared language, not the target language, not the same as the article, again, so that they're not just doing text matching. And then they, for example, if they need to indicate if the author would agree or not, like you saw before, and explain why. Well, I guess maybe a mix, right? So the statements, I might put the statements in the target language, maybe with some modifications, so it's not matchy. But then explaining why, I might let them use some shared language or English, right? Nothing wrong with that. An example of what I mean by like matchy, right? Or that just doing text matching. So if we look at this text in Spanish and then the 3 questions, even if you don't speak Spanish fluently, you can probably do some text matching or symbol matching and figure out where the answer is. And so in those cases, the student is probably relying a little bit more on matching the symbols to the text, as opposed to truly demonstrating that they understood what the text was saying. So in those cases, then I would change the questions to the shared language so that the student is demonstrating more of comprehension of the language itself. Kristen, oh, great question. Is text matching okay for beginners? You know what, Kristen? I would say it doesn't do a whole lot for beginners or intermediates. I think beginners are probably going to be more likely to rely on text matching. And so in that case, the question you need to ask yourself is, what am I assessing? What am I measuring with these questions? If you're trying to assess comprehension, then for beginners, I would definitely put the questions in a shared language. In the Cecile, the reason why I'm saying L1 is because it's not always the L1 of the students, right? Or even the teacher. So if everybody shares a language, for example, in my case, I share English as the dominant language with my students. It's not my first language, but I share it with them. So then absolutely for beginners, if, and this is a big if you have a good shared language that everyone feels comfortable with, then yes, I would put the questions in that shared language. Yeah. The text matching is just not contributing a lot to language development, so I'm not sure that it's worth it. Yeah, in that case, I would definitely, for beginners, if you have a shared language, go with a shared language for the questions. Now, sometimes, right, as they learn a little bit more, maybe you can start mixing it, right? And there's nothing wrong with mixing languages. So then maybe experiment with that, you know, and see how much of the questions is matchy. Then those maybe change to the shared language. Yeah. All right. An example of what they can do actively with the text is text reconstruction, right? And so text reconstruction has many, many different flavors, and I have a video unpacking different versions of text reconstruction. This is just one version of it. You may have done things like strips of paper and the students have to put it back together, right? They have to put the paragraph back together. Another way that you can do text reconstruction, which I do because it's very easy to do, I don't have time to be cutting things, is simply to just cut phrases from that text that we're going to be reading and putting them in that lovely list that you see up top, A, B, C, D, E, right? And then I keep a blank with a number within the text itself. And so the students have to reconstructing by figuring out which letter goes in each space. And at first you might think like, oh, but then this is too easy. But then when you start doing it, and you do have to be paying attention to the context of it and what it is saying. Do they need to understand every single word? No, but that's not our goal, right? With reading or with comprehension. It's not just 100% understanding every single word. What we want them to do is understanding the basic message of it to make sure that that fits well in that particular spot. So this is one way that they can be paying attention to what they're reading and reconstructing the text. And then maybe you don't need to be doing just the traditional comprehension questions at the end. Maybe a few true, false, and then you move on. But you were assessing comprehension as the students were reading. Something else to do, I guess, with this would be more with oral text, right? So especially with videos, sometimes if it's just audio, would be to help the students with ear training. And a way that we can do that is, yes, they're going to be watching or listening to it, but we're going to be helping them out because sometimes this is the part that scares them the most, right? It's simply to listen to that audio and then the brain gets overwhelmed and they didn't understand, right? So one way of doing that is to incorporate multiple modalities and especially incorporating the transcript itself. So maybe in step one, you give them a portion of the transcript, maybe not all of it, because you want some of it to stay oral, and that's okay, I understand. But maybe some of it with some blanks. And the students have to work maybe together, maybe individual, to predict what words go in those blanks. And so that gives them some time to be understanding that language that they're going to be encountering in the video. Then in step two, we don't want them to get overwhelmed with reading and listening. So now we're going to put the transcript away and just listen to the audio. You can tell the students to close their eyes if they want to, but just listen to the audio and pay attention to the audio. And now go back to reread that transcript and see if you can revise the answers as best as you can. Now, since the students already read the transcript and already engaged meaningfully with it, trying to predict the words, you bet that when they're listening to that audio, maybe you can play it twice, why not? You're listening to that audio, those words are popping up like, oh, that wasn't what it was, right? So then they can go back, right? So they're paying more attention to the sounds and the meanings because they already more at ease, that they already know what this person is going to be saying. And then, of course, then watch the video. I would suggest with captions to help all students, and then confirm the answers. Of course, you can keep going, explain differences between what you predicted, what the transcript said. You know, you can elaborate more depending on the level of your students. We have a question on novice level. Can you give a text box? Yeah, I would probably say for, are you saying for predicting the words that go into the blanks, to give them like a word bank? Yes, I have no problem with that. What I would maybe say to challenge them, it depends a lot, right? I'm just imagining things, but maybe add some words in that word bank that appear in other parts of the video, but don't go in those blanks. How about that? And so we already get them activating those words, but they know that they don't go there. Just my students sometimes just go with the easiest, like process of elimination. So I want to challenge them a little bit more. Some of them don't go in the blanks, right? Maybe we can do something like that. But yeah, no, it doesn't invalidate it at all. The main thing is for them to be paying attention to the meaning of the words, not just read the transcript. and all they're doing is looking at symbols and they don't know what it is, right? So, but the fact that you're having them engage is with it's a word bank or not, definitely is a way that they need to be paying attention to what this text says. Yeah. Good question. Okay. Another way that you can do active reading, video also, but it's a little bit tricky with video, is text annotation. And that is that you write things as you read. And there's many ways, which is like reconstruction, text annotation, again, different ways you can do it. You can do it in class individually with symbols. For example, the symbols that you see there are ones that I used in a workshop where I wanted the teachers to be looking at this list of ideas and then adding a symbol indicating their reaction to it. So you can do it with symbols. You can do it collaborative, maybe with several short texts. And so the students read, annotate, they pass it around. And when they pass it around, the next person is going to see that text with the annotations, and maybe they can reply to their classmate too. Online, you can use Google Docs, of course. If you want to use something more specific to text annotation and fancier, I guess, would be Perusal. And I use Perusal in some of my courses. And as you can see in this second screenshot, Perusal lets you add a comment, emoji, a picture, a link, a video, whatever you want. And they can even tag classmates. So sometimes they might reply to somebody and tag them, so the person gets a notification that they were tagged. Video annotation is also available in Perusal, although it doesn't look as nice, as neat, I guess, as text, written annotation. Another example of doing something active while engaging with the text would be a version of text reconstruction, but it has to do with infographics or things that have an icon, not just written text. And so, for example, in this particular infographic, what I did was I removed the icons, I covered them, and then I covered some of the text itself. And so one way of them expressing comprehension would be for them to either match, let's say I give them a war bank of icons, and then they have to put them in the right place, or they can write the text that is missing, or maybe I give them, again, more of a matching thing, I give them the text and they need to put it in the right place, right? So those are ways that they can be recreating the original, in this case, recreating the original infographic. Another example of this only works for reading, not for video, for them engaging actively, is jigsaw dictation. So for jigsaw dictation, the students are going to be working in groups. Each student gets one sentence, one thing that they are going to be dictating, doing the dictation for the rest of the group. So one student starts, you can tell who can start if you want to, it doesn't really matter. But one person starts, the rest have to write. The other person reads, the rest writes, the other person reads, and everybody writes, right? And so when they're done, everybody's going to have all 5 or 6 sentences written down. And then what they need to do is they need to put them in order to form a paragraph. So we're incorporating text reconstruction there. And for that, of course, they need to understand what they just wrote. So I like to let them first write individually because I don't want them to be influenced by somebody else. So first, quietly read everything you wrote and put it in the right order. Then arrive to a consensus as a group. And then, of course, continue using that text with other post-reading comprehension activities. Another alternative, depending on how big your class is, would be that each group has a different paragraph that you took from that article. And so at the end, you're going to do a whole class text reconstruction to figure out which group has the first paragraph, the second paragraph, the third paragraph. And this, again, the dictation side of it, I'm sorry if you don't like dictation. The dictation has a lot of value. So let's not ditch dictation here, right? Dictation's good. And in this case, you're having the students read things. They can help each other out with pronunciation. It's not a problem. Or how do you write it? How do you spell this? Well, the student has the spelling. They can spell it out to their classmates. The other twist on a classic, I'm sure that you have heard about the KWL chart, right? The things that they knew, they want to learn, or they learn, right? And so the twist that I do with it is that instead of doing a part pre-reading and post-reading, which is the classic, I turn it all into a post-reading chart. So the K, and I'm going to switch the L and the W, sorry. The K is things from the text that they already know. The L is going to be new information that they learned, and the W is going to be things that they're still wondering about that topic. And even the still wondering has to reflect the text itself, because if they're telling me what they're still wondering, but the text already gave them the answer, we got to revisit the text, right? So they can't be wondering something that's already in the text, right? But it has to be connected to and not wondering something about life. So everything has to be directly connected to the content of the text. It's just a twist on the classic, but there's nothing wrong with the classic KWL chart. Absolutely. Another classic that you probably already do, especially if you do stories, right, or even news events, putting events in order. Putting events in order, classic of reading comprehension, or even watching films. This is from a short film. This was when we had the pandemic. They did it in Jamboard, but you can do it right now with real life sticky notes. So the sticky notes have different parts. It doesn't have sticky notes, whatever you're using, different events that happen in that particular movie. And so they have to put them in order to demonstrate comprehension. And there's different twists to it. The first one is it's all input based and it's all true. So you as the teacher print everything out. And so it only serves as input. They're understanding what you gave them and everything is true. The option 2 could be that if your students can handle it, you involve them. So maybe you give them some of them, but then you tell them to create 2 more, add 2 more events that are not in these 4 that I gave you. And then option 3 could be that some are true and some are false. And so they have to not just put them in order, but that they have to figure out, does it even go here, or do we need to toss it, right? So you do a combination of true, false, and put in order. Another option, which we do with a story called La Tortuga Gigante, sorry, it's been a long day, La Tortuga Gigante, by Horacio Quiroga. And it works really well because the students are in charge of creating the options for the questions. And some of them get very creative or funny or tricky. So in step 1, you create the questions. So for example, question like which of the following is not a character in the story? You don't create the options, you just write the question. And then each student is going to get 5 questions, and they're going to write the 3 choices, A, B, and C. Only one of them is correct. So those are the examples of 5 of them. And as you can see, it doesn't have to be just which. It could be things like why. Why did he move? What was his life like? What happened on that particular day, or right? So you change it. Where, right? You can do any question you want. The student has to create the options, right? And we tell them to be funny or as tricky as they want to. And again, we say 3, but if you want 4, you do 4. If you want 2 are correct, you can do any twist you want to this. And then in step 3, the students are going to be quizzing each other. So they read the question and they read the options, and some of them laugh out loud, depending on what the option group they created. But they need to be quizzing each other and then writing down out of the 5 how many their partner got correct. Another example, what you can do, especially with infographics, right? So infographics present information in a icon, very, very short text usually, right? And you're essentially reading information in a very visual way. And so what we're going to do is to see if they understood the information. Could be for you to do the summary, written summary as a paragraph form of it. Most likely, I would say here in this shared language. Am I running out of time, Sarah?
I was going to interrupt you in 1 minute for a quick time check. So we've got about 20 minutes left in the webinar session, and there are some questions in the Q&A. So
can I keep going? Can I keep going?
Yeah, do maybe another 5-ish minutes or so, do you think?
Okay, I'll go fast. Okay. So in this case here, they complete the summary, right? So you give them, you write a summary here. Like, for example, here you can say that maybe the most popular activities are activities that you can do outside. Okay, so for example, right, you summarize some of these trends, but then you leave some blanks out, and the students need to be completing that summary with the blanks that would then correctly complete that particular summary for this infographic. Of course, you can change it, not complete, but to correct it, right? So some parts are inaccurate, so they need to fix them to Jody says, "One more ideas, then worry about questions." Okay. All right. So let's keep going. So the ideas that I have for the creating beyond the text. So one of them is kind of, I mean, Twitter, not right now, is X, and who knows what's happening, right? But let's still call it tweeting and Twitter. So this one would be for the students to use a site like TweetGen, where you can create something that visually looks like a chain, a thread of tweets. But the students don't have to have a Twitter account. I do not require that of my students, and I do not want them to be messing with it or get comments that they should not be getting, right? So this is just for the sake of visually looking just like a thread of tweets. So for example, if the text was non-fiction, oh, you tried a different one with TextGen? Oh, I didn't know about that one, but okay. If the text was non-fiction, so maybe a news story, right? Maybe a biography, I don't know. The activity that they would do would be something like, what would people tweet after reading this article? And then what would the author respond? So they need to be creating the little profile picture, the name, the username, right? And then what they would say, maybe with hashtags, and then what the author would then respond to that person, right? In terms of fiction, if it was a story, right? So what would the characters tweet and respond to each other? One thing that you can do is, if one group or one student creates the thread, maybe you tell that student to leave the name and the picture and maybe the username too, I don't know, blank or very, very vague. And the rest of the classmates have to guess who tweeted it, right? So based on the tweet content, who said that? Which character was it, probably, right? So maybe you leave the picture and the name out. Another creative project related to text is to create a movie version of this story. So we read a story called Una Navidad como ninguna otra, a Christmas like no other, by Gioconda Belli. And the students are tasked with creating the movie version of the story. So they need to come up with a new title that is still relevant to the story. They need to come up with the right images based on what happens in that story. They need to come up with a tagline. You know how movies have a little tagline that goes with it. And then they need to write some critics' reviews. And this one in particular was done with Adobe Spark. And so the student came up with, what would you save from a catastrophe? What was their tagline? I thought that was really good because it's very connected to what happens in the story. So that's one example, and the students got into it, and we did a little contest in terms of they voted for their favorite too. Anyway, a different alternative if you don't want to do a movie, or maybe you give the students choices. Why not? Some of them want to do movies, some of them want to do a Netflix series. And so this one is a template by Ditch That Textbook. And so in this template, the students are going to be creating the same, right? So a new title, images, description, oops, there's a typo there, I'm sorry, the description of the series, and then maybe start creating some of the episodes, right? Which is another way of demonstrating that they understand what happens in different parts of the story that they read. Another creative project, so this is the creating beyond the lines, but still connected to the lines, would be something like the who's texting who. And for this one, you can do the iFake text message or the texting story, which is an app. The iFake text message is what you see here. You can just take a screenshot of it. So the students create a text message exchange between two characters. As you can see, they put a question mark, so they don't know who it is. The other ones need to say who is texting who, and then optional, maybe if you want, for others, in addition to saying who's texting who, keep the texting conversation going. What else would they be saying to each other? Another option, if you don't want to continue the conversation, because, or maybe you don't want to do the whole who's texting who because it's too easy. There's only like 3 characters. Okay. Another option would be like the students create the text message exchange. They print it, bring it in, and then you cut up the strips of paper. So the other students have to recreate the dialogue, right? The who said what to whom and when, right? So they have to recreate the original exchange. Oops, it's not letting me go anywhere. Hang on. For some reason, my computer is dead. Oh, here we go. All right. So another, I'm totally running out of time, but I'll try to save time for questions. Oh, I'm almost done. I'm almost done. Okay. Only 2 more slides. Another idea you can do, this probably works better with intermediate and up, right? But the students, I love when the students are super creative and they're still relying on the knowledge of the text, right? And that is to write spin-offs. So option 1 would be to adapt the story as a different genre. So maybe the original was a very non-fiction kind of text, and now we're going to come up with a children's book that reflects that particular story, those particular events. Or maybe they do a comic strip, or maybe it was like Cajas de Cartón, but now we're going to do the thriller version of Cajas de Cartón, right? And so they have to take the original, but then change it to a different genre. Or option 2, for example, comic strips. Oh, Canva has wonderful, super easy to use comic strips. If you use Canva, and for educators, it's free, so definitely check it out. Another option for a spin-off would be to come up with a sequel. And this we do with Cajas de Cartón. They do have to come up with a sequel, and so they need to decide what stays the same and what changes. So part of the planning, pre-writing, is to figure out like what characters are going to stay the same, which characters maybe they need to explain why they're no longer there, right? What are the things that continue on in the story and what things didn't, right? So in a way, they are still reflecting, having understood the story, right? It's connected to the story. It's not something completely new and different. They still need to be reflecting that they understood what happened. And then option 3 would be to change only one thing. How does the story change if we change the place where the story happens? How does it change if we change the time in which the story happened? How does it change if we change the narrator? So maybe now instead of the kid is the dad narrating the story, right? And things like that. Okay, another thing they could change or be asked to change is to summarize the information, but changing the format. So maybe if what they read was an informational text in paragraph form, so now maybe let's create a brochure with that information. But now they need to, I tell them specifically, they need to include 3 things from the original text, so they do need to use that information. I want them to include new information, so they need to do a little bit more research to supplement it. And then, of course, images, right, graphics, make it look appealing. And once again, Canva is great for easy to use, easy to modify and tailor beautiful templates. So even brochures, this one is taken straight from Canva. And of course, I tell the students to not just copy from the text, They need to be synthesizing. They're not going to have as much space, and you don't want a long paragraph in a brochure, right? So there's a little bit of paraphrasing that also needs to happen. So I am done. I'm done with ideas. I'm done with ideas, and we have time. Woo! So of the post ideas so far, I know I gave you too many. Does anybody want to chime in and tell me like one that you already do and like, or one that you would be interested in trying, or one that you're not sure about? And it's perfectly okay to not be sure about things. The Netflix idea, Chelsea. Yay. Okay, good. Texting comic strips. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Elisa. Tweet all about it. Gia, you're here. Oh, hi. Okay. Texting, yes. The KWL, KLW. Yes, very good. Dictation activities, yes, Silvina. Very good. Movie posters, yes, and they're so creative, so creative. Okay. Wonderful. The jigsaw, oh, good. All right. Okay, and I think we have questions. Sara or Sabrina, do you want to help me out? Oh.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen real quick, Florencia?
Yes.
Because I'm going to make...
I'm just, if I may,
yeah.
Just here, if you want to see who I am, that is my link tree with all the links. So I mentioned, for example, I have a video on this and that. You're like, who, where? So if you go to the link tree, so linktr.ee/my name, Florencia Henshaw, one of the links in there is the link to my YouTube channel, Unpacking Language Pedagogy. And that's where I have the video on text reconstruction, the video on authentic resources, if you want to go check it out.
Florencia mentioned this at the very beginning of our webinar here, that she is also a collaborator with us as an editor on this Honing Our Craft volume, along with Kim Potowski. So this is really very much a volume written by educators for educators. It's 12 chapters long. You can see here those 12 chapters, and it's available on our website, and Sabrina will put the link in the chat. And so it's very great. We also have a sample chapter if you want to just check it out on our website first before you commit to anything, but it's an excellent volume, and we've got a lot of fun things happening along with it. The California Language Teaching Association, in collaboration with Cletworld Languages, is doing a book club for Honing Our Craft. So each month from September through April, we'll be reading a different chapter and kind of talking about it. So please be on the lookout for more information, and you can sign up for that. We have a full presentation of Honing Our Craft in a couple of weeks on September 18th. So Florencia will be back with us, along with Dr. Kim Potowski, to kind of talk about that book and do a Q&A. Our conference is based off of Honing Our Craft. This is a hybrid event, so in person in Chicago and online. We encourage you to check it out to get more contact, more professional development, to be able to share your ideas with everyone. And lastly, before I hand it over to Sabrina and Florencia for the Q&A, as you can see, and we can all see from Florencia, she has so many ideas and she has very high expectations, and I love it. Hold us accountable. So we did want to mention real quick that that's one of the reasons why we asked her to be a contributing reviewer for our Reporteros 3 book that has just been released. And so we're also happy to facilitate you guys taking a look at that if you want to check out some of these ideas that Florencia has helped us, work into our materials as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it to Sabrina for our first question.
I think there was a question about, is there a discount code for Honing Our Craft?
Yes, for sure. We can make sure that it gets sent out in an email.
Okay, there we go. So yes, Alice asked. Yes, Alice, there we go. Well, they'll send it over email.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sarah and Florencia. This was very useful. So let's go for our first question, which would be the first person mentions that they found out they're teaching a curriculum that is driven by Cover the Grammar ethos, and they're using a textbook, which is not CLET, that focuses on the coverall, verb, forms, etc. kind of activities. And the question would be if you have any strategies to create a space for more interpretive communication when this person also has to connect to giant vocab lists, grammar, and accuracy focused goals.
Yeah. That is a really good question. I did not include all of the ideas. And so for example, just to give you some context, the cajas de cartón, we use it in a course that is actually a grammar course. So I have to be doing a lot of the grammar part of it, and we do use text, and we are discussing a lot of the ideas because we want to work on that proficiency. But then we also have questions where we're helping them focus on form, right? And so we are talking about the use of different forms in the text itself, right? So that is one way that you can still be using text and comprehension questions, right? Where you're still working on that sort of the good part of language development. Now that is bad, but it's not going to do a lot if you just do a text and all you will do is like find examples of this. That is not going to do a lot for proficiency development. We know it, right? So I think that there is a way of building it. Even some of the dictation activities that I shared, you could, right? Find a sneaky way that you're still doing the comprehension of the text, but they still need to be accurately writing things, and then maybe you're incorporating certain structures and drawing their attention to it, right? I think that there could still be a way that you are covering those forms. It says anonymous, so I'm not sure who it was. I'm sorry, I'm not saying your name. But another example in this one, I was sneaky enough that this particular course, they need to be covering the if clauses. So the comprehension questions for the text are like, if this and that, then what would happen? If this and that, then what would happen? It's like I started writing a bunch of questions with a lot of the if, blank, conjugate the verb, So you kind of build into those drilly kind of activities, but then you still have to answer the question based on the text, so that sometimes there are ways of still doing the drilly part of it, but then let's still make time for the discussion comprehension part of language. Yeah. But I understand. I don't think it has to be, it's a compromise, but it doesn't have to be just I have to cover things, so I'm not gonna be focusing on meaning anymore. Well, no, we can still give meaning a chance. And then yes, sometimes you're gonna have to be compromising and focusing more on that accuracy and the drilling part of it. I understand that. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. We're gonna try and cram in as many questions as we can here and still wrap up. So I'm gonna move to one that came in a bit later when you were talking about the post-reading activities. And this one asks, would you suggest assigning the post-reading activities to the students before or after class?
Oh, after class. I thought the question was going to be like if I let them like preview the post before they read the text, for example, which is valid, depends on what you're trying to do. Not overwhelm them, but sometimes it's good to give them a little heads up on these are the questions you're going to be asked later on. So that I understand. After class, okay, now we're getting into the whole homework debate. Your context is your context, right? So it's going to depend a lot. In higher ed, we're used to assigning homework like that. But even, I'm going to be honest, even then, I know how busy my students are. So as much as I can, if they can do it in class, we do it in class. What I might do sometimes is assign some questions to make sure that they read ahead of time, because some texts are long and like we cannot be reading. We don't have enough time to be reading in class. But not everything. I want to use that time to be talking about the text in class. So this goes more into, it's not necessarily a language acquisition part of it, although I understand if there's concerns about outside help, I understand that as well. But I think it goes beyond language acquisition question. This is a little bit more about your particular context, the motivation of your learners, can they do homework? I think it goes beyond. I think it could apply to other other subjects as well, right? How much is it good for them to be doing at home, or can we realistically assign for them to be doing at home versus doing in class? I wish we had more time with them in class and we could do more things, that's for sure. But I understand also sometimes we do need to assign some things to be done at home. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, the next question would be if there is any way to better adapt this for a fully online asynchronous course.
Fernando, it's a great question. That's the video reading example that I showed, that is a fully online asynchronous course. So a lot of what I have are the questions are built into our LMS, our Moodle site. Moodle is going away now, we're switching to Canvas. But it's basically all built in. And I have like different ways of doing that, but the impetus for the video readings was that I was tired of the students copy pasting into Google Translate. And I had no way of, I mean, there's no class, it's all asynchronous. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna make you read in the form of a video that you cannot copy paste, right? So that it's just a little bit of that ingenuity sometimes that we have to do to decrease the odds of a translator. Of course, that never goes away. But I think that there's a lot of the activities that you can do, that you can adapt. Not all of them are going to work very well, of course, because things like some of the dictation, things like the jigsaw dictation, sometimes it just doesn't work very well, you know, especially if the students cannot get all together at the same time. I mean, some of the activities simply are not going to work or be able to adapt it, but I think that a lot of the basics that I said can still be adapted, which means that we can still have them do a lot of the pre-reading or pre-listening activities online, and then they can get even like immediate feedback on things. We can also do some of the text reconstruction. I do it in the online course. You can also do a lot of these creative projects work better because then the students have more time and the tools right in front of them. So I think that there's a lot that you can still take away from it and adapt it to fully online asynchronous. But that's what I teach in winters and summers. So yeah.
Great. Well, we are 2 minutes over time. I'm just going to read out loud the last question that we didn't have time to get to.
Okay.
And I think this one is a longer question. So unless Florencia has like a 1 minute answer, can you speak a bit more about the importance of interpretive mode for language acquisition? Often teachers or administrators see the 3 modes as equal in terms of time needed, or output as equal or more desirable than input. Maybe administrators might expect to hear more language coming from students rather than the teachers, even at those novice level courses. That's a very large question, but maybe Florencia, if you have a quick, put you on the hot spot.
Jason, I think Jason already knows the answer because he saw a much longer workshop than I did. But it's a really good question. I know I went fast because I wanted to get to all of the ideas, simply because a lot of times I see the opposite, right? We talk about how important it is, but then we don't have enough ideas. So eventually we move on, right? We move on kind of fast. So I wanted to spend more time on how to get more out of text. But of course it is absolutely important. And I appreciate the 3 modes, but I understand the consequences of it is that they are weighted equally, and then inevitably we're giving preference to output, right? Or that we still think that language, okay, so to simplify it, if we see language acquisition as, or rewind, if we see language development, proficiency development as 2 things that need to happen, and this comes from Bill Van Patten and linguists before him, right? So this is nothing necessarily new. So you need to be building a system, and some people call that the acquisition portion of it. So you need to be building the system, and then you need to be able to access the system, right? So there's something about the mental side of it, and then there's the skill side of it. And a lot of the emphasis that we put in class is the skill side of it, which tends to be the output or the retrieving. And I understand why we want them to work on retrieving. I get it, 100%, I get it. But if there's nothing to retrieve from, then they're not acquiring, right? They're not developing a system in their head. And the main or only way, depending on which camp you are, but even then, the common ground is the most way that you can start building a system is through input, is through understanding, and not just understanding and moving on, right? We need understanding with frequency, with making the right formatting connections, right? Like just that building the system needs to be done carefully. It's not just exposure. It's not just understanding it once. It's not enough for the brain to hold on to it, so to speak. And so it's complex enough, but it's definitely, I understand that what we see sometimes is but the students understand me, so we need to work on output. But if there's nothing to retrieve from, they're understanding you sometimes for context, or who knows by what, right? Not necessarily to have a solid system yet. So let's spend more time building that system, and then of course, work on retrieving from that system little by little. But let's not always rush to the retrieving part where there's nothing to retrieve from yet. And so sometimes in terms of administrators, it depends on your administrator. But one of the things sometimes that I say, even on, sorry, this is going to sound bad, but even administrators who may know a little bit about language learning, you can fool them to think that you're doing an interactive activity, an interpersonal activity, where it's mostly input, if not all input, right? So if you're providing the language the student needs to use, it's input, it's interpretive. It's not interpersonal. It could look like interpersonal to an outside eye. Oh, the students are talking to each other. Look how great. And I understand you hear the students and it's like, the students are talking. This is very active. It's still all input because you gave them the language. They're just having to demonstrate understanding the language, let's say by selecting the right choice or whatever you're doing, right? Or very minimal output, like saying one word, but the bulk of that interaction is coming from language that you provided them. And I think that's what I see sometimes with some of these chatbots. And it's fine if what you're trying to do is to keep providing input, but you need to make it look like interaction, right? And so I think that there could be a way that you can still keep on working on interpretive, but making it look like one of the other modes, so to speak. Even something like presentational, right? There's a lot of language that you can give them, and then all they're doing is not copying, but maybe like reconstructing that and then presenting it. You gave them the language, they demonstrated understanding of the language, then it's still interpretive, it's still comprehension. So yeah, there are some ways that I know we're totally out of time, but I understand if you're being observed and then interpretive sounds very quiet, you get nervous. I get it, right? And there's nothing wrong with it for a language development person, but for the outside person, it's like, oh my goodness, the student, this is very passive, right? Or the teacher talked the whole time. Well, yeah, sometimes we do most of the talking if the students cannot say a whole lot just yet, right? So I understand some of that friction, and maybe, I guess, unfortunately, we have to come up with these creative ways of making it look like what the outsider expects, but we deep down know this is still, my activity is still mostly about comprehending language, not necessarily retrieving from their system. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Florencia, everybody. Thank you for hanging out these couple extra minutes. Let's give a nice little round of applause to our presenter today, Dr. Florencia Henshaw. We've loved having you. This was wonderful. Everybody's been asking, yes, you will get a recording of the presentation and a copy of the slides probably within the next week or so. And I believe, Sabrina, I don't know if there was anything we need to tell them about getting the certificate of attendance. Just a reminder.
Yes, of course. We're gonna place in the chat again the form to get the certificate. Just fill it out with your information, a full valid email, please, and we will give you that alongside with the recording and the presentation, of course. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe to our newsletter to keep in the loop of all our news and the future things we're doing with Florencia. You can also check our website for our future webinars and lives. Again, we're going to have Florencia very soon. And our next webinar will be on the 9th of September with Diego Ojeda. It's called Cómo humanizar el libro de texto. That one's in Spanish. And of course, if you have any doubts about materials, you can send us an email to marketing@cletwl.com. And if you have any other questions, just go for info@cletwl.com. And I
If
think I got it.
anybody can I just make one last pitch? If any of you are in Atlanta or near Atlanta, I hope to see you there. I'm going to be there September 9th. So come hang out with me in Atlanta on September 9th.
Wonderful. Well, with that, we will end our first webinar of our season. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Get some sleep. It's back to school time. Everybody needs it. Thank you, and we hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.